Well, here we are again, and it's been a few days. I thought I'd hit you guys with another one. This one here covers some Dodge Caravans and a couple of others. And this one here came in because the transmission had screwball shift patterns. It didn't. The lady that drove it, she had a couple of Dodge Caravans and another Chrysler Town and Country, and this was the oldest one they had. They didn't shift gears consistently. Some shifts were erratic, they were delayed, and there was no recognizable pattern. Sometimes the transmission would shift just fine. One time this girl came with a Hyundai Santa Fe that was doing crazy shifts. You know, she was telling me she could feather the throttle, and whenever she could feather the throttle and make it shift normally, but when she just let it shift up through its gears like it ordinarily would, it would hit real hard. And so I rode it with her with my scan tool plugged into it. I had a little Autel, that little gray one, you know, the DS708, I think, or whatever it was. I've got one of these, and the school had one too. But anyway, we rode down the road, and I noticed it was jumping from second to fourth. It just jumped right over third gear. When it did, it would jerk a crick in your neck just about. You know, that's when she was driving it normally. And I looked through the menu on that thing, and it said something about resetting the transmission adaptive strategies. And I said, well, pull over, switch it off. So she switched it off, and then I said, now turn it back on. So she cranked it back up. I said, I didn't say crank it up. I said, switch the key back on. A lot of times people get confused. You say switch it off, switch it back on, they crank it up. And that's really kind of dangerous if you're under the hood working with your hands in the belts. You don't need to tell people to turn on the key unless you've, got your hands out of the way before they do, because they may start it up. Anyway, she switched the key back on. I reset the adaptive tables. It asked, you sure you want to do this? I did. She drove it, and she couldn't get it to shift rough anymore. That was cheap, it was quick, it was easy. Sometimes shift strategies will do that. I've seen transmission shift crazy because of a bad mass airflow sensor that you'd have sworn was a transmission problem, but the mass airflow sensor would be throwing a code, and then you track that down, pop a mass airflow sensor on it, and the supposed transmission problem would be gone. But anyway, this one here, they'd gone to a transmission shop, and they said, well, you need a new radiator installed because there's water mixed with transmission fluid. And so I said, okay, that's interesting. The shop wasn't interested in doing the work on that transmission. They weren't interested in replacing the radiator either. I don't know what the problem was, but they just basically pushed the van out of there and sent it on its way. And so there was some water in the fluid, but the cooler is external to the radiator on this one. Now you might say, and somebody sent me an email the other day from another video I had done, and they said, how in the world does water get in the transmission fluid if the transmission fluid pressure is 35 psi to 40 to whatever, and the coolant pressure is only 16? Well, the answer to that is when you switch the vehicle off, the pump quits and the line pressure goes nowhere, goes down, and the pressure in the cooling system is still there. And so at that point it would weep into the transmission over time. But in this particular case, that didn't apply because the transmission cooler wasn't in the radiator. It was external from the factory. But this thing had some water in it. I don't know how it got there, but maybe it went through some high water and it went in through the vent. Who knows? So how else could it happen short of somebody pouring water in the dipstick tube? All right, so we pulled a PO700, made the decision to do a full fluid exchange, and we did a filter change to clean the pan, replace the shift solenoid assembly. And this little shift solenoid, I've seen them throw codes for shift solenoid issues and all that. And typically, if I'm doing just a licking a promise and a let's try this kind of a thing, I'll usually put one of those on there anyway, because they don't cost much. They got them at the parts store. You got to make sure you get the right one. And so a little bit of glitter in the pan, some fine fuzz on the magnet. There wasn't nothing bad in there. 150 on the clock. After replacing the transmission fluid, the filter, and the shift solenoid, the code was gone and the transmission shifted just like it was supposed to. Well, we just did the standard stuff. A lot of the time, this one guy that I knew that was one of the executives at the college, his wife drove a 2004 Mercedes, and he was telling me when he got that car for her that and he bought it used, that the transmission fluid was supposed to be lifetime fluid in that, never supposed to have to be changed. And so after they'd been driving it a couple of years, he came in there and he said, well, I got an issue here with the way the transmission shifted on this Mercedes. I got my wife, and I said, well, why don't we go ahead and do get the right fluid for this particular transmission, because I know you can buy it from Mercedes, and let's go ahead and do a full fluid exchange using the machine. And so we did that. I had actually built an adapter, you know, that was just for that fluid exchange, because they didn't have one on the machine that would fit that Mercedes. But I, you know, used an AC line that had a couple of O-rings on it and cut that little, you know, the part where you click on. I cut that off and shoved it up in there. I got a picture of that somewhere. But one way or another, when I did the full fluid exchange, all the transmission problems were fixed on that Mercedes. You know, there's some price or some cost to that, but if you can replace all the fluid and fix the problem, you know, why do you need to go in there and start rebuilding it? That's what I always think about. There was another one. It was a Cadillac, like a '05 CTS or something, a crossover. It was a red one, and the transmission was acting crazy. And the fluid on that transmission, on that automatic transmission, was dark color, looked like brake fluid or something. I don't know, I've never seen transmission fluid that color before, but we did a full fluid exchange on that one and fixed their shift problem too. Sometimes that's all it takes. It was kind of like changing oil on a Power Stroke diesel, you know, 7.3 model, or 7.3 liter, whenever the friction modifiers break down, and the anti-foaming, not friction modifiers, break down in that one. You just sometimes just changing an oil will take care of crazy things that those are doing. Anyway, well, when I published that repair in Motor Age, when I wrote Motor Age, there's a self-proclaimed transmission expert sent me this nasty email, and he said if there was even a teaspoon of water in that transmission, you should have took it apart and rebuilt the whole thing. So I went back to the, I called the lady back, and by the time the Motor Age article went in print, it had been about 6 months since we'd done that repair. And I called her up and I says, tell me how that transmission's doing that we did the fluid exchange on and all. She said, well, I've been driving it to Montgomery, that's 2 or 3 hour drive, you know, once a month ever since then, and we've never had any more trouble with it. The proof's in the pudding. If it's fixed, even if somebody else feels like they know more than you do, and you should have done this and you should have done that, the proof is, how does the transmission work? Did we cheat them out of anything? Did we do anything that was going to put them in danger or anything like that? She was willing to give it a try. We gave it a try. It worked out. I don't know if it'll work out like that next time, but this time it did. There was an engine vibration we run into that turned out to be caused by a rock that was trapped in the mount. And the problem had come about suddenly. I don't know how that rock got in there, but it got wedged in there somehow, and just getting that rock out of there took care of it. Another vehicle came in with a complaint running hot in traffic. That's typically going to be a fan, right? We tested the fan using my method of hooking a test light. And you pull the fan relay, hook a test light between between power and the wire going to that leaves the relay going to the fan, and that light will light up. Then you turn the fan through really slowly and see if it goes off. If it goes off, you got a dark commutator on that fan, and that's a go, no-go test, which is the best kind of test I can find to make sure that if it fails that test, I know it's bad. Now, if it passes that test, there could be other problems. But the simple fact was, the fan checked out okay, but we did find this when we disconnected it. This was cooked. Fans pull a lot of current. They have a tendency to have this snowball of developing a little resistance in a connector or a relay or a fuse or something, and then it starts to get hotter and hotter and hotter as the current tries to flow through it, and eventually current stops flowing, because every time it oxidizes a little bit more, it gets a little more resistance heat, go together and all that. I had an instructor one time at a Chrysler school try to tell the whole class that resistance and heat weren't related, and I took him to the mat on that. Nobody else wanted to lock horns with him about that, but that's ridiculous. Why do they make resistors out of ceramic if resistance doesn't make heat? Really? All right, so there was a high mileage 15 passenger van, didn't drive quite right. Customer said it was all over the road, and so the owner had decided to put a couple of new tires on the rear and move the good tires to the front, which it was a bad idea, not because of the best tires going on the rear, but because of the kind of tires they were. The new tires they installed on the rear seemed softer than they should have been, even with a recommended 80 psi of pressure. And the front tires call for 50. And the new tires caused the van to kind of like yaw on turns. It was they were, sometimes you'll get tires that are just softer than they ought to be, and that was what was going on with his van. And when we put the firmer tires to the rear, but they still had plenty of tread on them. It's not like we were putting anybody in any danger. It drove like a different vehicle with the firm tires on the rear, and they were a little wider and had a little bit more road grip too. But remember that anytime you're putting just 2 new tires on, always put them on the back. If you put them anywhere else, you're opening yourself up for a lawsuit. But in this particular case, we were trying to figure out what was making this thing drive so crazy. All right, now we worked on a Crown Victoria that came in with a complaint. It was all over the road, and the same car had come in complaints of a popping noise and a brake squeak a couple of weeks earlier, and we just fixed that, but we hadn't noticed any all over the road visits that time around. So I drove the car this time. I could tell the front end was kind of tight. The steering almost wouldn't return to center unless you helped it, so it wasn't all over the road. I figured maybe the stiff steering was what they must have been talking about. So on the lift, took the front wheels clear of the ground, turned the steering wheel. The front end was really stiffer than normal, and when we popped the tie rod ends loose from the spindles, both of the spindles were hard to move by hand. And this was, we had ball joint issues. And we put some sway bar links on it while we were there. Now the other Caravan had a real strange rattling noise. It was coming from the belt area. It seemed to be tied to changes in engine speed. Things would seem normal until the engine was accelerated in a service bay. Then the noise would come and go with changes in engine speed, and it always exhibited the same pattern. That was very interesting to me. Now that pulley right there, if it's an overrunning pulley, can make some racket like that. And my initial thought, having heard similar noises before, was to condemn the pulley. Now it's equipped with that pulley, and they like to make noises. And they actually have that kind of pulleys. Actually, I cut this one open so you can see it's got spring in there. So one way, you know how a spring is, one way it tightens up and the other way it gets smaller. And so that's kind of how that works. There's actually a couple of springs in there. But anyhow, the whole point is that's kind of what one looked like that we saw before that was making a lot of noise. It had come all to pieces on the inside. And so, well, this had to be an overrunning pulley noise. It just sounded like it, but that ain't what it was. So we pull the round cover off, use that 17 millimeter Allen socket. They send one with the new pulley sockets you can use, but I built one by brazing a 17 millimeter bolt into an old cheap socket. And so when I felt the relationship, I also used that to check the transmission fluid on Volkswagen Bugs, because it had that same size, Well, when I felt the relationship between the pulley and its hub, you can usually tell when it's bad. This one didn't seem to be faulty. So I wasn't going to throw a $70 part on it for that, so I sent that pulley back. And our whole inspection had taken place with the vehicle sitting flat on the ground, so we wasn't looking under it. We were just trying to figure out, looking down through there at the belts, what was going on. Put it on the lift, pulled the right front tire and a splash shield, and I found the problem. That little water pump flange is Y-shaped. You've probably seen that before. And so you can actually take the pulley off and turn it and slide it on there so you can get the water pump out. Pretty ingenious the way they did that. This one was busted. The engine, one of the ears was broke off the water pump. And that's what was making all that racket. I don't know how common that is, but I hadn't seen it before. We threw a water pump at it and put the alternator back on it, new serpentine belt. That's all that one needed. On that same van, though, we had put a radiator on it, that particular van there. I remember this now. And the radiator that we put on there was one of these that we bought from the local chain parts store. And she actually drove the thing. When she was driving it and it was really hot weather, she would hear it percolate. And so I got to investigating that. And I noticed when I put the radiator cap on there, it didn't have the tension that you would expect to have squeezing that spring. So I got another radiator cap, and I put that one on there, and it felt the same way. And I said, this radiator, the tolerance is between where the cap goes in and where the seal seats down in there is too far. And those tolerances weren't right. And so I got the new radiator cap, and I took the gasket off, and I stacked the gaskets so that it would have tension. So that it would have more tension because the gasket was thicker. Now this was just an experiment I did. When I put it on there, all of that percolating went away. So it just needed more pressure on the radiator cap. That was an odd situation. You see that sometimes with Chinese-made radiators and stuff. Chinese-made power steering hoses will just bust as soon as you put pressure on them sometimes too. Chinese power steering pump pulleys sometimes will be so tight you can't push them on there without running your 2-rock wheel cylinder hone in there until you machine them out a little bit. But anyway, sometimes we stumble into situations like that. Well, I spoke to another veteran technician that fixed a Pontiac that had been everywhere for an overheating problem. Somebody had installed an aftermarket fan, hooked the wires up backwards, and he noticed by the way that dirt was moving on the ground under the car when he cranked it up, that the fan was pushing air instead of pulling it. We got a blower motor one time for a Buick, and when we put it in there, it was making a lot of noise. It wasn't moving any air because it was spinning backwards because it had been built backwards. They put the magnets in it upside down when they built it. When we hooked it up the way it was supposed to be hooked up, it spun the wrong way. And that was a brand new Parts House blower motor. Got another blower motor, it was fine. Alright, so this one here is an easy one. I was sitting in my office one day and this girl came in there about 4 in the afternoon. She said, "Hey, my Trailblazer sitting out here won't start." So I went out there and I plugged the scan tool in, spun it over, didn't see an RPM signal. Well, the crank sensor is right there. It's fairly easy to get to. You can stand flat-footed by the fender and reach down there and put your hand on it if you got long arms. And I popped the crank sensor out, and the parts store brought a $16 crank sensor she paid for it. I put it back in there and it fired right up. That was real easy. Of course, the thing about it is, if you fix one real easy this time, it may be tough next time. She's going to expect a silver bullet every time. That one was fairly simple. Well, there's a customer that had been overcharged a lot by other mechanics. That was the one I'm talking about, the lady on the Trailblazer. She thought I was Superman, and that's what I was trying to say. Well, a farmer dropped his truck off at the dealership I worked at one time, and I went down there to the cashier's window, and she said, "That farmer gave us a blank check, signed his name on the line, said, 'My truck's skipping and I want it fixed.' What do you do with a guy like this, Well, I was wanting to make sure that next time that guy had some work done, he came back, because if he trusted us that much, I wanted to make sure we didn't betray that trust. And so I found at the dealership, a lot of the time when we were working on them, we would just replace one spark plug wire if all the rest of them looked good, because they had just one plug wire in the parts room. That was routine. Parts stores don't like selling just one spark plug wire most of the time. They can, but they don't like to. They like to sell a whole set. And sometimes just one plug wire will cost as much as the whole set, depending. But I replaced one plug wire on that guy's truck because the plugs were in good shape. I don't know why the plug wire was leaking, don't remember. Somebody might have grabbed it with some pliers or something. But that guy's bill was very low because he signed a blank check. I didn't want to, think about that. It's pretty scary. Go to a dealership, they sign a blank check and hand it to the cashier and say, "Fix my truck." You can imagine what kind of a field day some people would have with something like that. I wanted to make sure the guy trusted us as much when I was done as he did before he signed that check and gave it to the cashier. Anyway, what kind of concern can be caused by this? Just about anybody that's done a lot of engine work can tell you that if you see a piston that's got stacked grooves on those rings like that, you're going to have compression loss right there. There's going to be some issues. Those are supposed to be on the opposite sides of the piston. All right, test number 1. Engine sludge can bring about oil starvation that leads to bearing failure and can be caused by what? Frequent short drives. Now, some of these questions you've heard before, and it's going to see if you burned them in. Bad thermostat, poorly operating PCV system, or any of the above. Just about everybody's seen sludge like that. Most of the time, whenever there's a problem with variable cam timing systems, it's because there's sludge everywhere, right? Okay. EGR system failure can cause higher combustion chamber temperatures, pinion detonation, higher NOx emissions, or any of the above. A technician's been led to DTCs to investigate fuel trim numbers that are as follows: short fuel trim 0, long fuel trim 27. Which one of these would that be? Fuel filter restricted, crankcase oil contaminated, fuel pressure low, or any of the above? If an engine is knocking because of rod bearing failure, this could be due to A, rust clogged injectors, B, plugged EGR passages, C, a broken relief valve spring or stuck relief valve, or any of the above. Technician A says an engine oil pump is a positive displacement pump. Technician B says all engine oil pumps turn at half crankshaft speed. Who's correct about that? Technician A says a bad radiator cap can cause rust and corrosion buildup in a car's coolant system. Technician B says a large pipe on a heater core is generally the heater core's inlet pipe. Technician A says most coolant systems call for 50-50 mix of coolant and distilled water. Technician B says water pumps driven by the back surface of the serpentine belt and a water pump driven by the engine timing belt generally spin in opposite directions. Who's correct about that? Technician A says injector firing frequency is directly tied to crankshaft sensor input. Technician B says on an engine with a crankshaft sensor and a distributor, improper distributor rotor alignment can be corrected by adjusting the ignition timing. Who's correct on that? Technicians investigate the no-start condition on a vehicle with the following PID values. IET 101, ECT 45, barometric pressure 28 inches of mercury, transmission oil temperature 47, TPS 0.8 of a volt, battery voltage 12.5. What's the most likely cause? I'll let you study that one for a minute. $42 inside door handle on a 2005 Nissan Sentra is being replaced for a quoted labor price of $350. Technician A says the labor price is appropriate because of the skill level required to do the job. Technician B says parts and service providers should set their prices based on what they know the customer is willing to pay. Who's correct about that? Look at the answers. That's any of the above. Frequent short drives that don't let it. You know, a mom and pop car that they haven't driven very far except to the store and back, looks perfect in every way, can be sledged up on the inside so bad that the first time you take a trip, you know, a couple hours trip on it, all of that sludge can go down there and clog up the screen. Seen that happen. Bad thermostat, if it's running too cold, poorly operating PCV system, that can cause it too. So all of those could cause it. EGR system failure can cause higher combustion temperatures, because what is the EGR for? Exhaust gas is recirculated to lower combustion temperature below 2500 so it doesn't make oxides of nitrogen. All right, pinging and detonation, high temperature cause pinging and detonation, higher NOx emissions, or any of the above. That's any of the above. This one here may be low fuel pressure. It's not going to be the fuel filter restricted because that's not going to make the fuel trims go positive, right? It's not going to be crankcase oil contaminated with fuel because that's going to make them go negative, right? All right, so any of the above, no. So got to be the fuel pressure may be low. If an engine is knocking due to a rod bearing failure, maybe due to a broken relief valve spring in the oil pump or a stuck relief valve. Seen that before. This one guy rebuilt an entire engine because it was burned up, put it back together without even paying any attention to the relief valve. The relief valve was stuck and he burned the engine up he had just rebuilt. It was a disaster. Technician A says engine oil pump positive displacement. That's true. B says all oil pumps turn at half crankshaft speed. Not this one because it's on the nose of the crankshaft. The ones that are driven by the camshaft will turn at half crankshaft speed a lot of the time. But, all right. Technician A says a bad radiator cap can cause rust and corrosion buildup. It can if it's just letting the air come and go. That will cause all kinds of rust in the cooling system. That's just the way it is. All right. Technician B says a large pipe on the heater core is the heater core's inlet pipe. That's not right either. The small pipe is the inlet pipe. The large pipe goes back to the engine. If you hook those up wrong, or if when you're checking to see if you got a, blend door problem by pinching the heater hose, if you pinch the heater hose that's going back to the engine, you may bust the heater core. A lot of your inlet pipes, instead of having two different size heater core lines, some of them will have a restrictor in one of the lines. And if you hook the hoses up backwards on that one, it can bust the heater core, because what happens to the hose when you put your thumb over the end of it, make a restriction, the hose swells up. Heater core does that, it'll bust the heater core. So you got to be really, really careful about that. At the Ford place, we were having to put restrictors in one of the heater core pipes because it was making gurgling noises going through the heater core on some of the newer Tauruses. And this one guy kept putting it in the wrong side, and it kept busting the heater core repeatedly until somebody figured that out. A says most cooling systems call for 50-50, if it's the back side of the belt's driving the water pump, it's going to spin the opposite direction from one that's driven by the timing belt. That's just the way it is. On some of the older Jeeps, they would have V-belts on some of them and serpentine belts on the others. And if the water pump looked exactly alike, but the impeller was made different, and the water pump would bolt right in there, if you put the wrong water pump on there and it was supposed to spin the opposite direction, you'd have an overheating problem. Technician A says injector firing frequency is tried to crankshaft sensor input, and it is. Because whenever your crankshaft sensor is sending its signal out, your injector is going click, 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 and as your engine picks up speed, it goes tit-tit-tit-tit-tit, and it's not the cadence of the injectors that gives you that extra fuel, it's the length of the pulse width when the injector opens wider. But it actually fires. Now there are some added pulses between the regular clicks when you're applying your throttle. That's for your accelerator pump action. You know, those people that work on carburetors know about that. But anyway, that's technician A. You cannot adjust timing on an engine, typically one that's got a crankshaft sensor, unless it's like a 2001 Xterra, which has a crankshaft sensor for nothing except misfire detection. It'll run if you unplug the crank sensor on one of those. If the distributor has got a timing adjustment, you know, and it's providing the signal for the cam and the crank, then you can adjust the timing, you know. But something like a Jeep Cherokee or like one of these CSFI Chevrolets or any of these that's got a crank sensor that's providing the primary input, if you turn the distributor, you're just going to change the rotor alignment and cam sensor cam sensor pattern, you know. Now, we were talking about this one the other day. If you watched my video the other day, you know the answer to that one. The sensor that's lying is the open circuit. That's the one like on that Dodge I was talking about. $42 inside door handle. Neither one of those. It doesn't take but about 20 minutes to put that door handle on. We had a dealership I heard about in another town over here that was wanting to charge the lady, and her car wasn't all that old, but it was out of warranty. Her door handle broke, and they wanted to charge her $350 to replace the door handle. Probably because she was blind, I don't know. And she was blind, but she wasn't a dumb blonde. And she bought the door handle, and they said, well, we'll give you a discount on the labor. She said, no, I don't think so. So she brought it over there. One of my guys that hadn't even ever put one of those on before did it in about 20 minutes. And I was noticing one time when I was buying a clutch from for a Chevrolet that I was working on, both of the parts houses in town wanted $400 for that clutch. I bought one from the Chevrolet place, and it was a Sachs, the same brand, oddly enough. It was $150. So I asked the guy from one of the parts house franchises, it was a district guy, I said, why were y'all wanting $400 for a clutch that I could get for $150 from the dealer? And they said, well, we just charge whatever the market will bear. What's wrong with that picture? All right, that's the end of it. I hope you guys enjoyed this little video. I'll try to post one, maybe two a week sometimes. So hope you got something out of this, and I hope if you're studying for ASE tests, it helps you a little bit.